handout or old information, but we really don't have anything newer yet to use. So with that as an apology, let me explain what this one means. This is some work done by James Woodward in 1985, and he did this through a survey methodology and asked teachers of the deaf, and back in those days we didn't have as many interpreters working with us, so the subjects of this work were teachers. He asked them a variety of questions to discern which language or system they were using. And one of the examples he often gives is asking them whether they used American Sign Language. Then later in the survey, he'd ask if they used voice when they signed. Of course, if they answered yes, then he would go back up and discount that they did not use American Sign Language, since you can't speak when you're signing American Sign Language. So he used this as what I would say a rough way to tell us what languages or systems teachers of the deaf were using in 1985. You can see from this first layer of linguistic communication that about 1% of the teachers were using American Sign Language, and 99% of the people were using some form of English. Now, there could be some reasons that you would think that might have changed 10 years later, 10, 12 years later, but then again, maybe not. I know when I moved to Kansas, for several years, the Kansas School for the Deaf used Pidgin Signed English. And then they went on a site visit to Indianapolis School for the Deaf, and the next fall they used ASL. It always amazed me, you know, being one of those people that works with a lot of people that are slow to change how they signed. I figure, you know, the good witch of the north had to pop in there and, you know, change everybody to ASL. So whether people who purport to use ASL really in fact are using it might be a little larger incidence than what you see here, maybe not. Looking more on this side then of the overhead and looking at people who are signing, or people who are using English, about a third of those people are not signing and about 2/3 are. There's actually been a couple of research studies done since this time that would confirm that part of this overhead, that about a third of the students are oral only, or use some form of cued speech, and about 2/3 of our students use some form of simultaneous communication in English. If you go down to this no signing group, you see that most of the teachers who don't sign use an oral only approach. There's no differentiation on this overhead between oral, A-U-R-A-L, and oral communication, and there really isn't much in practice anymore either, but if there were at this time, it would have been all lumped together, and people who use cued speech. It's hard to get information about people who use cued speech because it is very atypical that it's a whole program. It's usually one or two people within a program, or it's used for speech work within a program. But again, my opportunity to travel and do in-service work in this country would suggest that this is approximately right. Of those people who sign English, a very small percent use sign only, and a much larger percent use some kind of simultaneous communication. When I was in Sydney this year, I had an opportunity to work with a man named Greg Lee, who is in charge of the North Rocks School for the Deaf and Blind in Sydney. And he did his doctoral dissertation a couple years ago on the languages and systems used by the teachers of the deaf in Australia, and I was on his dissertation committee. And one of the interesting things that he found was that people who use a simultaneous form of English without voice, documented by his language sample analysis, do sign a more grammatically complete English than people who don't. So if you've ever thought that when you just close your mouth and focus on your signing, your English seems like it's more grammatically correct, his work documented that that's probably true. And although for speech and audition reasons that might not be a good strategy all the time in the classroom, I think it is something for us to think about as we're teaching parents to sign, teaching paraprofessionals to sign, working on the grammar of our signing ourselves, that we might want to think about practicing without voice occasionally. And then he has some information about whether people used their mouth or didn't use their mouth. More relevant, thank you. See, this is back to Amarillo and Armadillo. Those of you who were at that in-service with me, oh, that was embarrassing. Okay, see, I just skipped right over that, got your mind off that. Okay, more pertinent is whether the meaning of what you're signing is encoded or it's not encoded, and it's not there. And much of the work that I used to do with analyzing sign systems would suggest that people who think that the meaning is encoded in what they sign because that's their focus, I sign this way because I'm interested in the meaning, when those utterances are really analyzed, lots of times the meaning isn't there. And through hundreds of language samples that have rendered me a contact user, this kind of a contact user, the other kind of a contact user too, but my advice when I work with people about trying to sign English better is to focus on the form, and the meaning will come right along. So that is something to think about. There's some systems that certainly focus on form, and others that focus on grammar. Those that focus on grammar are usually of two types. And you could have finger spelling. This would be the place where finger spelling everything would appear, because then the grammar is completely encoded. But that, as you know, is no longer done, so that's why it's not on this graph. Signs based on morphemes, roughly, is how C1 or MSS that's used in Amarillo is based. I mean, you can get real technical about it, but basically it's a system where almost every syllable of the word has a sign, and a system like C1 or C2 is based on some other kind of word division, usually in the case of C2 over here, based on morphemes. It gets very confusing because they call this the morphemic sign system in Texas, but it's really not based on morphemes. So, you know, you can tell how we really confuse undergraduates in our training courses with all the technicalities, and the bottom line is the most important thing about the talk I'm giving today isn't so much whether you've got all your jargon down, but whether when you're talking to somebody you're using terminology that you both agree on, or you all agree on, so that you can make other points of much more importance. So, like I said, that was work by Woodward, and we haven't really replicated that work, but my guess is it would be very similar today. If you're just dying to have one of my overheads that I didn't put in your packet, please see me afterwards, and that can probably be worked out. Okay, going back to your packet for a minute then, I'd like to start with oral English. I'm going to basically move from English to ASL, and then in English from the oral and cueing methods of communication to the sign systems. That will be my organizational plan here. And I have a little time limit thing that I made up for myself so that I'll only spend so much time on each one, and then we'll kind of move along. I put these handouts in because the first several handouts are all the basic kind of handouts that I'm sure you've all seen from oral education. Their gift to us has been to be the people that early on were telling us what to do when students who are deaf or hard of hearing were in mainstream classrooms, how to set those classes up, what were some of the factors that we needed to consider. And I provided those again. Some of them look like this if you're, kind of following along. I put those in because although many of us no longer teach oral only or oral only, we have many students who are coming to us with cochlear implants, or who are hard of hearing, or who do use a form of simultaneous communication and have audition abilities, and we need to remind ourselves of these gifts that we have from the field of oralism. There's nothing wrong with this information. It's great information. So I wanted to provide you some of that that's been updated and might be of use to you in your jobs. And then there's a couple pages for additional reading, and that goes through quite a bit of your handout until you come to a page where it says guidelines for the teacher with a student who is deaf or hard of hearing. And that's kind of the end of that section. So you might just want to take a second and flip through and know that when you get to this page, that's kind of the last one before we go on to cued speech. I think there is definitely a methodology to oralism. It's not just talking like I'm talking now. And I think the people that are training orally have a lot to offer us as we re-look at our skills in that area, look at how we can incorporate speech and audition across the curriculum, which is one of my big interests now. I have 4 children, the youngest of whom is 9, and my oldest girl, Breeze, just went to college, so she's a sophomore now this year. Went to college last year. So some of you who have heard me speak before have kind of grown up with my kids. And my youngest 2 girls have cochlear implants, and they're in public school, and that has really encouraged me and motivated me to be much more interested than I might have been in the speech and hearing facilitation across the curriculum in the elementary grades. So I feel very fortunate that in the area that I train in Kansas City, we do have an oral preschool, and I'd like to show you a little clip of tape from that preschool. Actually, this is a home visit that you're going to see, but just to kind of remind you all what oral-only programming looks like. So if we could see tape number 1.
You need to put the food there. We do need to put the food there. Wonder which one we should put first, the cucumbers or tomatoes? Oh, the tomatoes, okay.
Some of the things you might notice here is there's, I think, a movement away from blocking your mouth unnaturally and instead moving to the side or moving behind the student. Okay, that's probably enough of oralism. And with all my examples, I'm sure if you have a special allegiance towards one of these languages or systems, you probably won't be satisfied with, what might have been a better example. But my idea here is to just give you an overall impression of what these might look like. So you can pop that tape 1 out, and I'll be ready for 2 in just a little bit here. This is the beginning of about a 5-page programmatic and curricular modification form, which you don't have in your handout, that I have developed, and it was published part of it was published in the Perspectives magazine. If you don't get Perspectives, it's the best $15 spent. I think it's a publication from Gallaudet University, very teacher-friendly publication. And the idea behind this was that as we decide what modifications are possibly needed for a student, either before a staffing or during a staffing, you could check those off here, the ones that might be more relevant, and have a place for where you would do those kind of modifications, who would be accountable. Have you ever been into one of those staffings where everybody agrees that's a great idea, but then nobody ever is deemed the person to follow up? And then what some other additional comments might be. And I brought this along today primarily to just show the part that has to do with some of the things that are especially appropriate for students who use an oral approach. That you might want to talk about. Some of these I'm sure you remember from courses you took, and then others are a little bit newer in that we no longer sit the kid right in the beginning, right in the first row of the class, and see that now with more cooperative learning groups and more student participation, it might be over to the sides that the students sit so that they can see their peers as well as the teacher. as long as the pencil sharpener's not right there. And, you know, some of those kinds of variables. Again, I would certainly suggest that these are important variables for any learner who has any usable hearing at all, and then some of these have to do with visual, a visual environment as well.